Welcome back to the OPEX Podcast, where fitness is explained. I am your host, Robbie Bourke, and I am joined on today's show by my great friend, Danny Lennon from Sigma Nutrition. On this episode, Danny and I discuss everything to do with the principles of nutrition. This is a great follow-up episode to the one I done with Chad Wesley Smith, where Chad outlined the scientific principles of strength training. Here, Danny outlines the fundamental principles of nutrition that are key to not only optimizing your own training, but the training of your clients. This was a great episode, guys. I know you're going to love it. Stay with us. Danny Lennon, just for the viewers and the listeners who might be too familiar who you are, which will be zero at this stage with the success of Sigma. Give us an introduction.
Sure. I'll keep it brief, and I won't presume too much because, unlike you, I'm sure there's plenty of people that don't know who I am. The kind of
disgraceful.
Hopefully, after this, we'll take care of that. The kind of short version is I am the founder of Sigma Nutrition, which is a company that puts out educational media content around evidence-based nutrition as it relates to health, body composition, performance. And previous to that, my academic background is a master's degree in Nutritional Sciences and an undergraduate degree in biology and physics. And so really, since kind of finishing all my kind of studies, it's been about learning through coaching people. That has been going on for a number of years with various different general population and athletes. We've been kind of associated a lot with working with combat sport athletes, and that's where a lot of my own coaching has lied as well. Working on just nutrition throughout their fight camps, making weight for competition and so on. And last year I put out a kind of resource for fighters who couldn't work with us one-on-one, but still wanted to see our kind of ideas of making weight and fueling for performance and recovery. And that was a Sigma weight cutting system. So there are a few of the things that kind of been known for, and of course, as you mentioned, the podcast Sigma Nutrition Radio, and just kind of different ways of trying to spread good information in the kind of nutrition realm.
Sorry, I'm just moving my mic there so it's a little closer to my gob. And I'll definitely link up that the weight cutting resource you have on Sigma, and I'll be linking up everything with Sigma in the show notes. But that's great. And question I've actually wanted to ask you, we haven't spoken in a while. Did you envision Sigma to get as big as it is now? I mean, you've got over 2 million downloads. That's incredible.
It's weird. It's not like there was this moment where suddenly like, oh, this is great. Look how great things are going, how big it is. It was just started doing something, tried to work hard at it, tried to put out something that was useful to people. Yeah. And then it just rolls over and over. And it's the same with anything, I suppose, in life. When it's just your normal everyday life, you probably don't see things creeping up to what they are. But I'm very grateful that it has got to kind of the point where it's at. And I still think there's a lot more stuff that I could be doing better, and that it could be even making more of an impact. And as the same with anything, your goals just shift to kind of accommodate that. So I just tend to see all the things that could be better and I could be doing more. But it was never like, there was never a big master plan behind it, I suppose, is the short answer. There was no big thing of like, I'm going to get here in X amount of time and here's the exact steps I'm going to take. It really wasn't like that. I was far from someone who had stuff figured out, and it was like, let me go and try to do this. I like doing this type of stuff. I'm putting out useful information. Let me keep doing that. And then in the moment, you're just focusing on continuing to do stuff consistently. Yeah. At least to me, I'm sure there's people who are way better at this stuff than me that had this like master plan that they had it all figured out in steps. But for me, that wasn't the case. And even from here, kind of an idea of stuff I'd like to do, but certainly no kind of master plan of I need to be here in X amount of time.
Yeah, it's that kind of saying of you're happy but never satisfied. Yeah, because there's been certain times in my life too, like where you're like, oh, if I could just get to there, and then you get there and you're kind of like, if I could just get to there. Right, then actually, I suppose the older I'm getting, not that me or yourself are ancient, but I suppose we are getting maybe a little bit wiser. You'd like to think as we get a little bit older, in that, you know, and I suppose because of there's just so much information around us with social media now, but this concept of being more present and in the moment, and really it's all about the now, and it's not so much about, well, if I get to a specific destination, I've made it, whereas life is just a continual journey where you're trying to find bliss in each and every moment that you can. And of course, it's way easier said than done, you know.
Sure,
you're like, you know,
I mean,
everything's great, and then like your iPhone breaks, you're like, damn it, what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the things that you're probably told from all angles, and we've heard it a million times about you have to enjoy the process, and it's about that kind of process and journey and not the kind of destination. And you can hear that and you can rationalize it, but I guess certainly for me, and I wonder is the same for you, of it's kind of the only the past kind of year or two even that you actually start to see it with real life examples and start to really get that concept. And I've really started to see, yeah, Joe, this stuff that I want to do, it's not so much about where I end up with it. It's about what will that kind of process be, and having really the outcome is only there so that you have something to work towards, but it's still that process that you need to be enjoying. And as much as you can hear that and try and rationalize it, it's only when you start to make that realization in your own life that you actually get to a moment and say, yeah, it's actually the outcome is never the thing, because once you get to any outcome, it's always, okay, what do I do next? And what does the next chunk of time look like?
Yeah, big time. So listen, got you on to speak about the principles of nutrition. Now, I know you haven't put forward your own sort of thesis on it yet, like Eric or, you know, the guys at Renaissance Periodization or Andy Morgan. But I know that you'd be along, you know, very similar lines. And I mean, for me personally, you're my top go-to source when it comes to nutritional science. So that's why I wanted to have you on. And along with the episode we're going to put out with Chad Wesley Smith, I think it would be just a nice compliment, because Chad went through like the scientific principles of strength training. You know, obviously the principles he covers aren't just for strength training, they're for all sports training. So I thought that was a great foundational episode in terms of the training end of things. But with nutrition then, that's kind of where I wanted to bring you on as the expert to lay out these principles. Because, like, as you know, like these principles, when we first learned them, and you learned them before I did, and you know, mastered them in terms of with clients and yourself. But when I discovered them, and the reason I only discovered them was through you, like the liberation they give is just like unbelievable. You're like, oh wait, it's there's actually a hierarchy here, and it's like foods actually don't make you fat at all. It's you know, the way it was just like, this food, if you eat it, makes fat. It's like, well, if you're not in a surplus and you're hitting protein, and you know. So anyway, I'll let you take it away there. But yeah, for now and the next however long we speak, probably up to, you know, another 45 minutes, you can just go on it, and I'll ask questions as we go along. So nutritional principles, over to you, Danny.
Yeah, I like this concept because the thing I've probably talked a lot of the times, definitely on the podcast, and I've tried to really drill home in the seminars that I've done, is a concept that I've talked about in private with a few friends as well, including my friend Kieran O'Regan. I think you may have met him as well.
No, Kieran well, yeah.
And this idea of principles over methods, and it's kind of speaks to that liberation you talk about, that for anything, not even nutrition, once you understand kind of the foundational principles of how something works, then you can go and play with things whatever way you want and put in whatever method you want, and you're free from set rules that you thought were the case. And the same thing probably goes to your episode with Chad. Once you understand these things about training, you stop asking the question, what is the best training plan for me to follow? Right? It's about, okay, here's these different variables that will influence my results. So let me see what is the best way for me to organize each of those for me right now. And the same thing goes with nutrition. It's not about what is the best diet out there. It's about, here's these foundational variables that influence your results via nutrition. And for you right now, what would you need to be doing with each of these? And then you're kind of free from set kind of restrictions of a specific dietary approach you need to follow. And so if we think about all the various different influences or factors that can influence your results via nutrition, we could list all the ones that people typically think of: your calories, the various different macronutrients, how many the vitamins and minerals in the diet, the times you consume certain nutrients, the time you consume your meals, supplementation, hydration status, and so on. Right? There's all these different variables, and then the big thing to remember is that they're not all created equal. That some are going to proportionally have a larger impact on your results than others. And so with the probably the end goal is something worth keeping in mind, because these principles kind of stretch across the board, but how important each one is probably differs whether you are eating just purely considering health, if we're considering something just to manipulate body composition, or something that's aimed purely at athletic performance.
Yeah.
We can maybe talk about some of the differences later on.
And that's definitely something I want to touch on, because that is a key distinction. Because something sorry to cut across you. I used to say to the students when I used to teach at a personal training college was, you're ideally only eating for 4 things: to gain muscle mass, to lose body fat, for sport performance, or health and wellness. And I was like, don't confuse the strategies for each of those, because if you apply a strategy, say for health and wellness, to performance, it ends in disaster. That was like when like CrossFit athletes were like doing keto diets. It's like, what are you doing?
Right.
Your sport is like complete, like there's so much anaerobic activity in your sport, like, and then like they're all like getting fatigue issues, and some people are calling it adrenal fatigue. Or we'll let Brian Walsh attack that one.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think that's absolutely key. And just before I hand the mic back to you, because James Fitzgerald of OPEX, like, and I've touched on this too, and I don't know if you've spoken about it or you've definitely probably heard about it, but people often confuse fitness and health, like fitness for a sport and health. Like a heavyweight powerlifter is fit to be a heavyweight powerlifter, but he's not healthy. I mean, he walks up the stairs and he's almost dying of a heart attack. So when people confuse that, they think because the way athletes look, it means that they've got vitality. And like for athletes to specialize so much in one area, they actually need to kind of give up some vitality in terms of health and wellness to be able to be the best of their sport. So definitely with the nutrition, touch into that.
Yeah, and that kind of concept you were talking about is something I tried to kind of formalize my thoughts on before. I wrote this article called "The Triangle of Focus." It's up on the website, and it's essentially imagining. So for people who are listening to audio, imagining a triangle, and of those 3 points of the triangle, we have those 3 different components we just mentioned: health on one point, athletic performance on the other, and body composition on the other. And so if we take and we put a mark bang in the middle of that triangle, and we call that's where our focus is. At that point, our focus is equally distributed between those 3 goals. Nice. Now, for any one individual at any specific time point in our life, during some particular phase, we tend to be focused more in one direction than the other, right? And this can obviously change over time, but at one particular point, we tend to focus on one than the other. And the idea of this triangle of focus was that as you move your focus point towards any point in that triangle, by nature, it has to move further away from the other 2. Yeah. And so some easy examples, like you say, if you move that focus right out to the extreme point of body composition. So where's the extreme of body composition? What a bodybuilder would do: super low body fat, lots of muscle mass. If you take them in their peak condition, what they've had to get to do there, like what is that going to do to their athletic performance, right? It's probably going to tank it. At least on the day that they step on stage, they're not going to be in their best condition to compete in any athletic endeavor. Similarly, if you move an athlete to some of the things they need to do to, say, win an Olympic gold medal, as I think you alluded to, you're going to by nature have to do things that aren't great for your health, right? It's not what would optimal health would be. So I think that's important for people to understand, that all these variables influence nutrition, but depending on your goal, not only the relative importance, but moving towards one of those goals at any one time might move you away from the others, at least when you get out to the extremes. And so if we think about overall what is probably in common, what are the big pieces of the puzzle? The first one is obviously just caloric intake, or more accurately, probably caloric balance. Energy in, energy out, whether someone is eating at in a calorie deficit or surplus, or at a maintenance, so that balance between calories in and calories out. And no matter what the focus of the diet, this is probably, at least from a physiological perspective, the thing that's going to influence results the most.
Mm-hmm.
So again, like regardless of the foods you choose or kind of the breakdown of those or your nutritional approach, if you are an athlete and you are trying to fuel performance and recovery, but you're just simply eating way too little calories, your performance is going to suck no matter what you do, just because you're not consuming enough energy. On the flip side, if you are trying to eat for body composition, you eat way too many calories, we know, of course, that means you're likely to gain body fat if the surplus is large enough over an extended period. And then similarly, where it kind of ties in with health, and this is kind of a kind of byproduct, is that if your body composition is worsening over time and you are continuing to eat more and more calories, that is obviously a negative for health. And you can look on the flip side, if someone drastically is under eating for a long period of time, like you see in certain clinical scenarios, then that is going to be a negative health outcome. So the overall influence of calories is going to be probably the most important thing to pay attention to. Other factors that are going to play a role, and we can maybe prioritize those afterwards, would be macronutrient breakdown. So protein, I would say, is probably more important to consider than the other two for general body composition and health. For athletes, we'll talk about it a bit differently. Micronutrition, so the nutrient density of the diet, your things around like nutrient timing, meal frequency, and then supplementation. Now, if we're kind of, like you said before, there's people that put good hierarchies in place that are, there's probably no need for us to reinvent the wheel on. So people can refer to, for example, Eric Helm's Nutritional Pyramid, which is essentially a hierarchy aimed at looking at nutrition for body composition. So the number one factor to consider, energy balance. From there, macronutrients are most important to get right. After that, micronutrients, nutrient timing, and then supplementation has a very small role, and that's the kind of tip of the pyramid. You see the guys at Renaissance, you also mentioned, who put in place a kind of pyramid aimed at nutrition for health. And you kind of see a slight change in some of the hierarchy where food quality or food sources would come in after calorie balance, because again, the exact breakdown of macronutrients or timing isn't as big a consideration for health in general. And then if we were considering something like athletic performance, it gets a bit more tricky, because if we're trying to optimize something, then all of these things have a lot of importance. And we can we should probably talk about athletes separately in a few moments.
Yeah.
So they're the different factors that play a role. If you were to say for the average person in the population, what I would think of, what are the most important things that are going to influence your results? Just for maintaining a healthy body weight and maintaining good health, you're probably looking at overall making sure you're eating a sufficient amount of calories for your particular activity level, that you're consuming enough protein, I would say, to maintain a good degree of lean body mass. That has a huge impact on overall health. With the other two macronutrients, I don't think there's much evidence to suggest that you need to eat in a certain particular breakdown or a certain number of each.
Gary Taubes won't be happy with
right. So, right, yeah. And there's a lot of people on the other side as well, right, on the low fat. So I think once you're eating at a point that you're not eating such a low fat intake that you are going to be like deficient in dietary fat or getting negative health consequences from low fat diets, once you're eating enough, and that if you're eating, say, enough carbohydrate to fuel a sport, if you're competing in it, really the exact amount of carbohydrate and fat in the diet for the vast majority of general people just doesn't matter that much. So it should just kind of fall in line with where your natural food preferences are, allowing you to get a sufficient amount of protein and an adequate amount of calories, and that most of your food quality is pretty good. So, and beyond that, I think you could probably take care of the other things like micronutrition and hydration and so on, just from some core good quality like principles to go from. So there are the different factors that influence it from like a kind of physiological point of view. I think for a practical point of view, we could probably talk about some other rules or guidelines I would typically tell people to follow.
Yeah. So just before we go any further, just of one or two questions. So when you talk about calories in, calories out, there's still a lot of confusion and sort of misinterpretation about energy in, energy out. So like, for instance, people say, well, like, the microbiome, and that will change how much you absorb and digest, and like, so they start putting all this thing. So then it can't be about calories in, calories out. And it's like all energy in, energy out states is that if you're in a deficit, your global weight will go down, and if you're in surplus, your global weight will go up. And then like people go, well, I've had people on 1,000 calorie diets and they gain weight. It's like, well, then there was something mechanistically in their system that perceived them to be in a surplus. Like that's just so like, and then the people saying, oh, it's not about calories, it's hormones, and again microbiome, and just how do you answer those type of questions then when you're still trying to get the point across that still doesn't deny thermodynamics?
Right. And I think that's the point, that some of this is kind of this miscategorization or trying to label, oh, if you're saying that this calories in, calories out thing is true, then you don't understand hormones, or you're saying hormones don't matter, or food quality doesn't matter. And it's like, that's just like, that is not what anyone is saying.
Yeah.
It's that the thing that's going to drive change in body composition most predictably from your nutrition is, on the average, what your overall energy balance is doing. Now, to address some of those kind of other issues, one, if we're being super technical, I would agree if someone said that whether someone's in a calorie surplus or deficit or at maintenance isn't exactly predictive of what their body fat will do or body weight will do.
Yeah.
And so when we're thinking of energy in, energy out, really technically all it is telling us the difference in energy status or energy availability in that body. So how much energy is going in and out of that system. That doesn't necessarily have to relate to changes in body weight. So for example, let's say someone is eating at a weight maintenance and their body weight is staying the same. Now they start supplementing with creatine. They haven't altered how many calories they're consuming, but yet you would reliably see an uptick in their body weight of a couple of pounds, at least in that first week or so, right? So it's not this direct relationship where you can only see a change in body weight via a change in calorie balance and vice versa. What it does do is that when you just consider most of those variables and like small outlier cases, in general, calories in, calories out, or the change in energy balance is a good enough proxy for us to get a good idea of what's going to happen to someone's body weight and their body composition. So again, people will say something like, well, it can't be calories because then it'd be like 2,000 calories of sugar is the same thing as 2,000 calories from chicken breast. It's like, no, that's not what people are saying either, right? It's your macronutrients of those calories have a very clear impact on your body composition. And so, for example, the impact on lean body mass. But if you are doing most things in what would be, let's say, an evidence base or just basic recommendations that you would give someone for fueling healthy and appropriately for exercise. So you're eating X amount of calories, you're consuming enough protein, you're doing some resistance training, you induce a slight calorie deficit. When all those things are at play, then you are pretty reliably going to see someone lose body fat. Now, it's not that deficit that you induce isn't going to say, okay, you decrease someone's calorie intake by X amount of calories, you will get this Y number of body fat loss over this time frame. You can't predict it that way, but it's a good enough proxy that when you put all that stuff in place, you are going to see someone lose body fat over time. And so, yeah, that's typically how I would respond. I'm sure there's a couple of things I'm forgetting, but if you have any questions I didn't catch there.
It's perfect because it's just, again, it's something that I know you hear and I hear an awful lot. And again, to be honest, that's where my headspace would have been at 3 or 4 years ago, because I was one of these, it's not about, because calories in, calories out. You can't tell me that, an isocaloric diet that's 70% fat and 20% protein and 10% carbs is the same as 70% carbs, and because calories aren't created equal, and that's not what we're saying. And again, a key distinction here is that energy balance dictates your weight, And we're not talking about body composition of how that weight is made up. So body composition, your macronutrient intake, that will definitely have more of an impact than just your calories in, calories out. So you got to be very careful with your wording there. What I mean you is like, I mean, not towards you, Danny. I mean, people,
Of course,
you know, the differentiate
yeah,
between weight and then when we're talking about the composition of someone's body.
yeah,
Because I mean, I remember we had this discussion through Facebook message, and then I was being like very obscure with my question, and you were like, technically you're right, but like that's never gonna happen. And my question was like, you actually technically can get fatter in a deficit in terms of your body composition could get worse. Let's say if you had no protein, didn't do any resistance training, and were just like starving yourself, and all you ate was either carbs or fats, technically you would get fatter in terms of your composition and your weight would be going down. But that's an extreme example, so it is.
right. It's essentially in that case, your body fat percentage could go up because you lose so much lean body mass if
Lean
you
body
decide
mass.
to just like
Yeah.
never move.
And like that's an extreme, yeah, that's an eye rolling. Okay, if you want to bring it to that
Right.
level, but who does
Yeah.
that? Yeah.
Yeah. And so, and I would say again, if people are going to be like super technical, again, energy balance is kind of showing us the changes in energy as opposed to weight directly, just because there are some outlier cases, but in most cases, it's good enough for a proxy for us to say, okay, if you want to gain some muscle mass, the most optimal way is to go into a slight surplus, although it's not needed. So again, we could have someone eat at calorie maintenance, not go into a surplus, start doing some resistance training, gain muscle, and actually gain body weight. So it's not necessarily a requirement, but it's just it's a good enough proxy that if you want to lose body fat, for example, then a calorie deficit is what you're going to be targeting.
Mm-hmm.
One
So
other thing I'll mention actually
go
before I
ahead.
forget, because this is something that comes up in this kind of conversation of misconceptions about energy balance, is people saying, well, I started eating X amount of calories less and I didn't lose X amount of weight, or I didn't lose at the rate that you would predict by that. And one huge thing for people to realize is that a change in your calories in will have a knock-on effect and change calories out. So you can't just change one variable. It's not this simple input-output machine that some people make you lead to believe. It is quite complex, and any change in that input in terms of how much food you're consuming can have a knock-on effect and affect your expenditure. So if you're dieting, for example, your non-exercise activity thermogenesis will go down, and your subconscious moving, your have a lower drive to move about, your energy expenditure might drop, your metabolic rate will go down. So again, expenditure drops, you're eating less food, so your thermic effect of feeding goes down. So all these things lead to a decrease in expenditure. So like theoretically, if someone starts eating 500 calories less, but their expenditure also drops by say 150 calories, then their net deficit is actually a 350 calorie deficit as opposed to 500. So these little kind of nuances that in the grand scheme of things, we don't have to go into super detail, like when relaying like public health messages or to clients, but are just kind of interesting for people to be aware of, and more reasoning why energy balance still holds true despite it not being this simple input output.
The reason why I was laughing there to myself was it reminded me of Mike Israetel. Like he was given that demonstration of like if you ever see me and I'm cutting and I'm in a deficit and I have a stroke, you know, usually I'm sitting and leaning and talking very slowly. But then once the show's over and you see me in another video, I'm usually hyper. I was like, I've actually seen videos where he's been in both of those extremes. So it was a good point. Another good one too is from Ben House, who makes that very same point, Dr. Ben House, where he talks about, he's like, you know, you could give someone literally a 150, 200 surplus, and he's like, they gain weight on that. And he's like, then I've had other guys, like, I put them on 800 and they're still not gaining. So he's like, it's just, again, that comes down to individuality in terms of our physiology.
Right.
The next thing I want to ask, Danny, is how then do you relay to the general population person their caloric intake? Because like most people are like, well, like what's a they don't, you know, like they don't. It's funny. I'm thinking about your episode there with Jordan Fregenbaum, is that the guy you had
Right.
on? And I
Yeah.
was about to say the layperson doesn't know like the calories for a macronutrient, for carbs and protein and 9 for fat. And sure, on that show he said 50% of doctors that were questioned
Right.
didn't even
Med
know. So,
students. Yeah. Yeah.
but
Have no clue.
how do you get the concept of your recommended caloric intake to just a layperson? And
Yeah.
what calculators do you use? Because Ben House speaks a lot about this, that he uses multiple different ones. Because like he was talking about on a podcast, I think with Dr. Ruscio, or it was on one of those podcasts where he said like, my fitness pal is so way off in comparison to like Harris Benedict or one of those other models. So what
Right.
models do you use or recommend, and how do you relate that to a general population person?
Cool. There's two ways I'll take this. First is to be quite clear when I talk about the kind of most important thing overall is calories, and making sure, say if someone wants to lose body fat, we put them in a calorie deficit or something. That is not the same thing as saying that everyone needs to track calories and macros, or everyone needs to count calories or work out their number of calories and then work out what they need to eat at and start tracking and eating that specific number. It's very different. So for a lot of people, and again, especially if you're working with maybe people in general population who haven't came across this information before, or again, aren't kind of privy to a lot of kind of nutrition stuff, you might find a lot of people that you're just never going to get to track calories anyway, and they just might not like it. It might not be useful to them. It might make their likelihood of adherence worse. So there's still plenty of things we can do to get someone eating an appropriate amount of calories without actually having to count calories. So they're two separate concepts that I think are important to that we're clear on that point.
Mm-hmm.
So for, again, going back to knowing what principles we're trying to change, we might know with a specific client, okay, we want them to decrease their kind of current caloric intake. Now, if we're not going to get them to track that, or they don't want to track, we can still give them guidelines and recommendations that we know if they follow them, their caloric intake is likely to drop.
Mm-hmm.
Because this is how every single diet has ever worked for someone losing body fat. It's as someone has found out a nice way to, if people follow this rule, they will start eating in a calorie deficit. That's every single
You're wrong.
diet.
It
Right?
was all about removing the dairy and the gluten and the meat.
Right. So, I mean, so now this is where you can kind of get creative as a coach when you think about, okay, this given individual in front of me, based on their food preferences, based on their kind of schedule, based on the reporting to me of when they're most likely to overeat or when they have access to food, their training time, all the factors you'll collect in a consultation, you can start getting an idea of, okay, what changes could we make that's likely going to decrease their intake. So that's one way to go about it. And I'm happy to talk about that side of things from a practical point of view, because I like doing it a lot with clients. The other side is if you are going to look at calorie estimates or get an idea of where someone should be, probably the best way, if you have time, is just to get someone to track their habitual intake that they're currently maintaining their weight on, see what their average is over the course of 7 days. You see that average intake, it's like, okay, here's our starting point. When someone averages this number of calories, they're typically maintaining their body weight. So we're going to decrease that calorie number by X amount. So you might, depending on how fast you want their weight loss to be, you may decide to start with, say, a 15% reduction in calories or 20% reduction or whatever it is. So 15 to 20% is a pretty good starting point. That's a pretty mild and pretty doable for most people. So, and again, you can change that based on who you're working with. There's plenty of examples where you'd want to go faster or slower. But if you say, we're going to take, this is their intake on average over the past 7 days. For the next week, we're going to reduce that by 20%. And then we're just going to track their changes in body weight and see that it's trending in the right direction. That's a pretty good way of going without having to use any calorie calculator. Now, if you're going to go from the start point, like you said, there's lots of calorie calculations that have been used within research, Harris Benedict, Mifflin St. Jour, and so on. To me, I really don't care what someone picks, because the accuracy of any of them isn't going to be all that great, right? So some are going to be closer maybe to others, but we really have no idea of what someone's calorie expenditure is going to be on a given day. Like, no idea. So all of these are just going to be rough estimates to put us in the right ballpark. Most of those will be fairly close to one another. And so whatever one you pick is a rough idea. You use that to make your starting point for the first week or two. And if things are progressing at the right rate of progress, great. If it's going too slow, you're going to make an alteration. And if it's going too fast, you're going to make an alteration.
Mm-hmm.
So where you actually start for those first 1 to 2 weeks in the grand scheme of things doesn't matter that much, because you have however many months or longer that you're going to be working on this. So for me, for example, one that I found particularly useful is one that I saw by my buddy Joseph Agu, who is a sports nutritionist based in the UK. He wrote a good article on this before, where he showed some very simple numbers that people can use to get a kind of really quick start point of multiplying body weight by, I think it was something like
22?
I think it was like 24.2 for men and 22 for women.
And that was in kg,
like
just for the US listeners, so you'd have to recalibrate that for pounds. I think it's multiplied by 10 or 12 then by pound for pound.
Yeah, I think he has it in the article of to do it, but it's essentially just taking that, and the way he came up with it was looking at, if you run, say, the four most commonly used equations from research, and what the numbers would be for like the average, like some average sample cases that he put in, and you compare it to these numbers he came up with, they were pretty close. They're kind of in between all of them. And so if the exact accuracy of any one equation isn't going to be perfect anyway, we may as well just get a rough starting point. So like I said, once you pick one of them, I mean, if you're going to go Harris Benedict, fine, it's perfectly fine. It won't be super accurate, because none of them can be accurate. So just pick something, start with it, see the response, and after 1 to 2 weeks, you're probably going to alter anyway. That's what's going to happen in the vast amount of cases. So yeah, I'm not particularly drawn to any one particular equation people must use, or really that influenced by how accurate they need to actually be.
What sort of rate of fat loss and muscle gain do you typically like to see? Of course, it's going to be different again, because everyone's physiology is unique, but what would your typical ranges be?
So are we just talking like the average person that just wants to lose body fat, not really care about performance?
Yeah, just someone looking for better body comp. So like fat loss in one end, and then someone trying to gain some muscle on the other. And what are the sort of rates you'd like to see there?
So really with fat loss, it's kind of interesting in that if someone's goal is just fat loss, they don't care about athletic performance right now, and they're going to be lifting some weights and eating a high protein diet, to some degree, you can go pretty fast with them. Like you can go a lot faster than people think, and not cause all these issues that people think comes up with aggressive dieting. You probably saw I've written a kind of 3-piece article on that relates to kind of aggressive dieting, and so really it comes down to probably what is the fastest rate that someone's going to actually be able to sustain till they get to their target weight or the target amount of fat loss they want. So obviously there's pros and cons to going at a faster rate. So the faster one being that you, or the biggest pro being that you get your dieting done in a shorter window of time. And so for a lot of people, that's quite psychologically appealing, that they have to go on a diet for, say, 5 weeks versus an extended, milder diet for 10 weeks. So again, depending on someone's preference, you could go on the faster end. For other people, going too fast will make it more likely they just find it too difficult or start binging and so on. And I think it depends on people's motivations, how used they are to dieting and those types of things.
Yeah.
So if you're looking for an average start point for most people, I would say somewhere between 1 to 2% of their body weight is probably a good start point. Probably about 1 to 1.5% for nearly everyone is very, very doable. And again, from there, if you base that on their overall body weight, and then you just will decide how long they're going to diet for. Regardless, I would probably...
Is that per week then? 1 to 2% per week?
Yeah, per week. Sorry.
Why do you do percentages?
So purely because it will be very different to try and get a, say, 50 kilo, 5 foot woman to lose a kilo of body weight per week versus a 120 kilo powerlifter to lose 1 kilo per week. It's a very different thing. So I would just tend to work on a percentage of that. And the same reason why for a calorie deficit, I tend to get people to reduce their calories by a certain percentage, say a 20% reduction, as opposed to every single person reduces it by 500 calories. Because for, again, that 50-kilo woman, a 500 calorie reduction could be a third or more of her usual intake. And for a guy who's doing a ton of training, a big muscle guy, nearly 200 pounds plus, that could be literally, it could be like 10% of his calories. So again, percentage for that, and a percentage for body weight change per week.
Cool.
I think about 1.5% per week is very doable for most people. Good starting point. And like we say, we can talk about loads of cases where you would go a lot slower, and cases where you would go potentially a lot faster. Potentially, if you want to go aggressive diet, if you can adhere to it, like, you could really go at as fast as a rate as you can stick to, not go crazy on, and maintain whatever level of performance you need to in the gym. So as ever low that is, and there's loads of examples where people have ran like a protein sparing modified fast for a couple of weeks, right? Like, that's a crazy low diet, kind of like basically like a crash diet. Certainly not something you would recommend across the board, but is doable in the right context. But on the average, I would say 1.5% per week.
Well, what about on the other end of that in terms of gaining?
So gaining is considerably slower in terms of the rate of change, and is probably most directly related to the training history of the person, how long they've been training. So for someone new to training, that can be pretty quick. So I would just like, for that person who's just starting to lift weights, just like start lifting, eat a ton of protein, eat plenty of food, and kind of just see what happens for that first kind of couple of months. Then once someone's kind of more intermediate to kind of advanced, you're probably looking at a change of maybe like that 1% figure might be over a month to 2 months in terms of actual muscle tissue. So if you kind of correlate that to like, what should your scale weight be going up by, it would be a bit more than that, because again, you have to account for changes in glycogen and water when you're in a surplus. Some small amount of body fat will probably go on over the course of a gaining phase. And so on average, if you say 1% per month increase in body weight, that's probably a good place to start from. That's quite I would say conservative, and is maybe a slower than some other people tend to recommend. But I think if you are looking just to put on muscle mass, like, you're not really going to get much more out of it than that. And my kind of favorite phrase to say back to people when they consider gaining weight and how calories relate to this is something that Eric Helms said before, when he said, calories aren't the stimulus for gaining muscle. Calories are simply permissive. So the stimulus is that training that you're going to do, and all you're doing is using enough calories and enough of a surplus to allow you to actually build that muscle. And the extent that that surplus actually is far less than a lot of people believe. It's probably, for most average size guys, it's probably going to be a couple of hundred calories maybe. So a 200 to 300 calorie surplus is probably going to be doing fine most of the time, and there's certainly no need to overeat by 1,000 calories extra a day. It's probably just going to lead to more fat gain, and you're actually not going to probably build all that much more muscle. So I would say like around 1% of your body weight per month, perhaps, is an average figure.
Okay, just before we move on to the macronutrients, how then are you getting that? You were saying the strategies for the general population to sort of follow along, or you said to touch back on that,
Sure.
like how you can get them to stay within a caloric range without them having to really ever knowing about a calorie.
Yeah. So I mean, this is like the fundamental kind of thing to do with coaching that I suppose most coaches have been doing for a long time. If they don't get people to track, it's like looking at what someone's currently doing, where in their diet is the lowest hanging fruit in terms of the big things they're doing wrong that we can modify, and then what recommendations or habits or routines can we build in to try and make something here better, either take out something that's not useful or put something in that is better. So
just for you go on there, just when you say lowest hanging fruit, I remember one year, my father, usually every November he goes off alcohol, but I remember like one year he went off and we were down in Tipperary where he's from, and the whole family, Jesus, what diet have you got your father on? I was just like, just told him to stop drinking beer.
Right. Yeah.
And it was just
Yeah.
I was just thinking the caloric deficit he must have went into, because like if you're drinking 10 beers a night, 5 nights a week. Now I'm obviously maybe exaggerating, but
Mm.
that's a serious amount of a serious caloric deficit like
Sure.
induce. But
Yeah.
just funny thinking like lowest hanging fruit is like 10 beers a night, that might have something to do with it.
Yeah. So I mean, it's really not all that kind of like groundbreaking in terms of identifying what people are doing wrong. What the probably more the art of the coaching comes in is coming up with ways that are going to be that they people can actually implement that are going to allow them to make the changes required. And so one of my absolute favorite quotes around coaching ever is I mentioned this previously on some podcasts is Mike Teixeira called it coaching is essentially creative problem solving.
Yeah.
And it was like the best quote ever to sum up what a coach really should be. It's like, let's look at what this person is doing. We go and identify the potential things that could be modified or that they're doing wrong or could be doing better.
Yeah.
And now your job as a coach is to kind of step away from that, know what happens from a kind of science perspective. But now for this individual, we have to be creative and come up with some things to solve this problem.
Mm.
And so an example I can give could be you have a particular client, let's say their biggest issue is every evening when they get home, they'll have a normal dinner. Then in the evening time, they tend to snack quite frequently that they weren't aware of. You started keeping a food diary, and you saw that they were snacking 3 to 4 times in the evening, racking up a ton of calories just watching TV, and really weren't all that bothered by food. Like they weren't exactly hungry. So
Yeah.
maybe for this particular person, one like a simple recommendation you give is, okay, you come in and when you have your meal at 6 or 6:30, that's your kind of last meal for the day. And you can have your normal foods early in the day, have some kind of snacks and your breakfast and lunch. But because you're not too bothered in the evening, let's have a hard cutoff time of 7 p.m. Now, we know, of course, that eating late at night isn't a problem for fat loss, or like eating carbs after 6. All that stuff is nonsense.
Yeah.
And you don't need to tell everyone to do it. But for this specific individual, just by making that one change, that probably eliminates most of the overconsumption they're doing. They're probably not going to account for that early in the day. And now, guess what? Their calorie intake has dropped. And so that's just one way that could work. You might find it doesn't work, but for that person, it could.
Yeah.
The same happens if someone isn't too bothered by breakfast, but feels that they need to eat breakfast because they were always told it's the most important meal of the day, but they don't have time to make something in the morning. So they stop at some shop or some petrol station or gas station on their way to work, grab something that's probably not all that great, and they're eating calories for the sake of it, probably pretty high because it's convenience foods. For that person, maybe a daily intermittent fast might be useful. Again, it's not required. It's not better than not fasting. But for this particular person, it might be just a convenient way to eat less calories.
Yeah.
And that's the way every diet works. It's just finding a way to get someone to eat an appropriate amount of foods. And so just thinking based on this person's preferences, what that might be.
So it's essentially it's just finding the correct strategy for each individual client.
Right. And it's just basing on, okay, what is likely to work for this person? What are their preferences? What is their kind of best times that they prefer to eat? What foods they like enjoying? Based on what they report as their favorite foods, would they actually be better eating a lower carb diet? Or maybe this person actually would be better on a lower fat, higher carb diet.
Yeah.
Or maybe we don't even care about what their carbs and fats are. We just, like one of the best known strategies for people who eat low protein diets is you get them eating more protein, and without telling them anything else to do, you see a reduction in calories. Like that's just like consistent across the literature. And all that's happening is people are shifting to higher protein foods, which in general are harder to overeat on, but also have a very high satiety value. And so they just end up eating less calories over the course of the day. Yeah. So again, nothing to do with calorie counting, but that change was the thing that was going to have the biggest knock-on effect for that individual.
Great stuff. All right, moving on to the macros. So, I think for the most part, protein is probably the most important of the three. In most contexts, in protein, I think it's the Greek word for primary, isn't it? So, but with the macronutrients, how are you setting the guidelines there on them?
So yeah, again, depending on the person, I think we have some pretty like clear guides for numbers of protein intake that would probably be optimal.
Mm.
So again, most of this literature is biased towards me looking at muscle protein synthesis and muscle protein balance and so on. But even if we take a health context of how important it is to maintain muscle mass over the life course, uh, that should be kind of primary goal. Can we do that through a nutritional strategy? A high protein diet seems to be very effective for that. If someone is doing any form of exercise, then getting not only appropriate amount of protein across the day, but distributed in a certain fashion. So say 3 to 4 meals of 20 to 40 grams of protein across the day is going to be beneficial for muscular repair, particularly the meal they have after training. And then it's quite obvious for someone looking at body composition, if they're looking to maximize how much lean body mass they have, either if they're gaining that or preserving that whilst they diet down. So whether it's an athlete, body composition, or health, I think a high protein diet can be particularly useful, particularly when you're combining that with someone who is trying to diet down. And the kind of two benefits you would get from a higher protein intake being that preservation of lean body mass and also that high satiety impact of high protein meals to try and mitigate some of the hunger that you're going to get when you're in a calorie deficit. So I think for the kind of most people trying to max out that response, somewhere kind of the literature kind of tends to flip flop, or at least has different ranges depending on which kind of review you look at. But on the average, you could probably say somewhere between like 1.2 all the way up as maybe 2.2 would be good quality protein intake. So just to clarify,
What did Jose Antonio have? It was a 4.4, was it?
right? Yeah. So yeah, I should give people the units of this. This is grams of protein per kilogram
Per
of body
kilogram.
weight.
Yeah. I think
So,
for Americans, it's usually like if you're athletic, they're going a gram per pound, isn't it? If you're athletic.
right. So that the 4.4 grams per kilo would be like double that. That'd be like 2 grams per
Yeah,
pound,
per
I
pound. Yeah.
guess.
Yeah. So
Um,
for anyone that doesn't know, we're talking about Jose Antonio from the ISSN, who ran this high protein feeding study where the participants apparently consumed 4.4 grams of kilogram per body weight. So, over 2 pounds per pound for the American listeners. But they had to consume a lot of that through liquid because they just couldn't get that in through solid means, couldn't they?
yeah, I think that was the thing, that to rely a lot on supplements. Speaking to that point, I said it's very difficult to consume that amount of, or a very high amount of protein just from food because of the
Yeah.
satiety impact. Again, if you look at the food choices, you're not going to find typically foods that are like these really hyper palatable, very easy to overeat foods that are high protein. Typically, it's actually ones devoid of protein that are high in carbs and fat that are your typical junk foods or processed foods that are very easy to overeat. So somewhere between 1.2 and 2.2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight, probably towards that lower range if you're just like the average person trying to be healthy. Probably goes up more towards if you're trying to maximize muscle gain, when you're in a calorie surplus or at maintenance. The most recent review, I think, was a paper by Morton, which said 1.6 grams per kilo was the most you needed to maximize muscle protein synthetic response. Other people have kind of put that around 1.8. And then from a practical level, you'll have a lot of coaches talk about, well, just to kind of err on the side of caution, or to allow for some outliers, or just to make sure you're not only getting enough for the MPS response, but just overall to consume enough if there is some variation there, or if these numbers aren't exactly correct, go to 2 grams per kilogram of body weight. Again, it's an easy number to remember. So I think that's doable for most people who are athletes who are focused on building muscle. For the average person, if you're around 1.5 grams plus, you're doing pretty good.
Yeah.
And if you want to diet, it might be an idea to push that up closer to 2 grams per kilo to help with maintaining muscle and to give some more satiety. And then probably right at the extreme of like up towards like 2.5 grams per kilogram or even higher could be the real extreme cases you can envision of like a bodybuilder in a contest prep who is very, very lean, wants to try and hold on to every single ounce of muscle that they have, and is going to be dieting hard and training hard as well. You might want to push up to that higher intake. So there's some kind of rough figures to go with.
Just before we move on then to carbs and fats, with protein, this is something I've had a conversation with James once or twice. James has said, like, as we get older, our protein requirements go down. Now, I'm not too sure if he's meaning more so our ability to absorb and digest protein definitely goes down as we get older. But there's other people, like, I know Brendan Egan, and then there was that guy from McMaster University, and they're saying that our protein requirements go up. And then, like, if we have things like sarcopenia and things like that, like, so, like, is it a case that actually, is it nearly like a paradox in that our protein requirements actually do go up to offset like muscle wastage and sarcopenia, but at the same time, our ability to digest and absorb is probably getting, slightly worse, I suppose. It's not as quite as good as when we were younger. Is that the case, or what's your thoughts around that?
So what you're probably kind of getting into is the realm of this concept of anabolic resistance, which is essentially as we get older, and particularly as you look at elderly populations,
we get more catabolic.
You have this, it's essentially a decreased sensitivity of the muscle to stimulus that would usually lead to muscle protein synthesis. So the main ones we look at is resistance training, and in this case, we're talking about protein feedings. So this anabolic resistance would indicate that for someone that's elderly that has developed some anabolic resistance, they could consume that, say, 30 grams of protein that if me or you consume it would max out that muscle protein synthesis response. For that elderly person, that they have a decreased sensitivity to that protein feeding, and so they don't actually maximize MPS through that feeding. And so to overcome that, they would have to consume more protein, or potentially some of the other interventions that are being looked at in research, like supplementing with extra leucine or things like HMB, fish oil. There's all different things that are being looked at. But essentially it's the best way to think of it is it's a decreased sensitivity of the muscle to that high protein bolus feeding to maximize the MPS response. So if we're trying to think of protein feeding as a way to maximize how much muscle we not only build but then hold on to over the life course, then that kind of I suppose the irony that comes in is with these elderly populations, you get a case where they have this decreased sensitivity, which means to get the same MPS response, they might need more protein. But what tends to happen is people actually find it much more difficult to get that level of protein, particularly when you think of the appetite and typical dietary habits of kind of elderly populations on the average.
I'm assuming that the means for that conclusion are just off general elderly population. So like if you've got somebody who's obviously resistance training, like, I mean, you look at someone like a Paul Chek, he's not like your average mid 50-year-old man. I mean, he looks like he's 30 from a body standpoint. So that's one thing too. I'm always like, this is another conversation me and James Fitzgerald had as well, is that, like, you read these, because we were actually, two of us are on a big skill acquisition buzz at the moment, and there's a fascinating chapter in one of the books I read, Nonlinear Pedagogy and Skill Acquisition, where it talks about how emotions can impact your learning. And then obviously if you think about like self-limiting beliefs, and like we're often told, after 30, you reach your maximum physical potential. And it's just like, yeah, that's if you do nothing. Like Fred Hatfield squatted 1,040.
Right.
So it's just like, I think, and then so you could be putting that thought in your head, like, oh, I'm kind of in my 30s now, my joints are starting to ache, I'm not the same as I was when I was 21. And it's just like, that's, you know what I mean? And then like, because you read in paper too, it says, well, after 30, your strength increased by 1%. It's like, yeah, that's if you do nothing though, like, So I think like, it says like, oh, older people, sarcopenia and
right. I agree. There's a whole list of things you can do to kind of mitigate a lot of the things that tend to happen on the average. And so comparing, let's say the typical person that's say 65 plus versus someone who consistently does resistance exercise, eats high protein diet, has a general healthy lifestyle, sleeps enough, all that type of stuff is very different. And that applies to a lot of the health research. When you pick someone who's doing most of those fundamental things right, that's probably quite a bit different to someone who's not.
Yeah, big time. And we see that too, like and I'm not having a go with any vegans, vegetarians, but like the vegan diets. So see these people who are vegans are way healthier. It's like, yeah, because usually they're more health conscious and they don't smoke and they exercise and they meditate. And
Right.
like these people over here who ate the processed meat were smoking, didn't exercise, you know what I mean? Came from a freaking whatever shitty neighborhood or,
Right.
so there's so many of those variables. But I know we're coming up to, we're close enough in time here. So, well, another 10, 15 minutes. If you're still good, we'll keep rolling.
Yeah, good man.
But getting into setting carbs and fats, I know like kind of once protein is set, like, and people who resistance train have good protein intake, it's much of a muchness. So maybe just how do you go about then setting the carbs and fats?
Again, for a lot of the average, I'd say like a typical general pop client that comes in, a lot of the time, like I said, it doesn't matter that too much. I'm not too fussed. I think just prescribing them a calorie and fat intake to have just gives them extra things to do that make things more difficult than they need to be. And so unless someone wants to, for a lot of those types of clients, we don't prescribe them anything. They'll have a kind of, if they are going to be tracking food intake and say it can be quite useful to get them to track calories and keep an eye on protein intake, what a kind of baseline level of tracking, especially for someone that's new to it, might be, is just to get them to track their overall calorie intake, have it fall within a kind of 100, 200 calorie range that we have. So let's say we want them to eat roughly around 2,300 calories a day. So we'll say, okay, let's aim to have your calories fall between 2,200 and 2,400 on average over the course of this next week. And we'll have a kind of minimum protein threshold we want them to be above. How far above that they go on any particular day, I don't care. But it's like, okay, here's your baseline. I want you to get above 140 grams of protein today. Whatever the exact numbers is, we don't care. As long as it's above that, fine. And wherever there are carbs and fats come on any particular day, I don't really care. As long as they're not trying to specifically keep fat as low as possible or keep carbs as low as humanly possible, as long as just kind of eating foods that kind of are generally good quality, that they enjoy, that fit in with this overall template of appropriate calorie intake and sufficient protein, where the carb and fat numbers end up, I don't really mind. That changes, of course, for someone who has a more specific goal, like if it's a bodybuilder, someone competing in a sport, or particularly an athlete with a high requirement for carbohydrate, then we get specific with those numbers in the same way we'd start getting specific with calories and so on. And then rather than looking at weekly averages of intake, we would start looking at specific daily intakes and the timing of, say, those carbohydrates for an athlete. So that's where it kind of varies. But for the average person, it's not like, I just don't think it's useful to tell someone you have to eat 74 grams of fat today and 222 grams of carbohydrates. Just like, it's just not useful.
Yeah. What do you recommend for tracking?
So I get people just to use like an app like MyFitnessPal, just because it's quite easy to use. Most of them will have had some experience with it before or have heard of it. It'll be able to find or scan in most of the foods they're typically going to be consuming. Just get them to track with that. And then once they have those numbers for their calorie and protein, we have a Sigma Nutrition tracking sheet that we get all our clients to fill out. So they pop in whatever different metrics we've asked them to track, which will vary from person to person, but say it's calories and protein, they'll pop that into the sheet. That gives us a average for the week, a running average over as they input each day. And then so we can see on the average where their calories are falling.
I know this is a whole episode in itself, but fiber.
So really once it's not like below typical guidelines, I'm pretty good. So as a reference point, I tend to point people towards the numbers the Institute of Medicine give. So I think it's like 38 grams for males, 20 grams or 22 grams or something for females. So we give them those kind of numbers, make sure kind of it's above that. Again, if they're getting the food quality piece of their diet right, it shouldn't be too much of an issue to hit those numbers pretty easily. And so we use more of their overall diet quality as a heuristic to look at fiber. So I'd much prefer someone to be able to look at their food and see, okay, they're including a good bit of vegetables in their diet. They're having these good quality, minimally processed foods throughout the diet that make up a decent chunk of it, and therefore that's allowing them to hit fiber, as opposed to them having this like perfect fiber number, but it's all been through supplement or protein bars or something ridiculous, you know.
And just do you? I know this is a question some people ask. Do you include the likes of fibrous vegetables in your caloric intake for carbs? Like, do you include things like broccoli or cauliflower? Or?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it doesn't really matter if someone has a preference for not doing it. If it makes it easier, that's fine, as long as it's consistent. If they're looking at calories, I just get people to log everything. It doesn't matter either way. Once the tracking method is consistent, that's the thing.
Yeah.
Because if you're not making progress, you're going to reduce your target number, and as long as you're staying consistent, you're going to do it anyway. So whatever people want to do, but typically I'd say, yeah, just put in everything into your tracker, and then we can always look back and see on what foods they're consuming as well.
So we've covered calories in, calories out, or energy in, energy out. We've covered the macronutrients, which most people, or nearly everyone I know, says that they're the two main things to get right. That's, if we're talking 80-20, there's your 80% right there. Or, well, there's your the 20% that's going to get 80% of your results. But next in is the micronutrients, which again is probably going to be more due to food quality than, making sure if you're getting quality food, and you're probably going to hit those nutrient values. And before we dive into that, is there any testing that you know of that can show like legitimate status of nutrient requirements? And then the other thing is too, is what's like low for someone could be high for someone, and vice versa in those testing. But is there anything you know of? I know like there's that, what's it called? A spectra cell analysis. I think right. Brian Walsh was very critical of that. I could be wrong now, so don't quote me on that. But is there anything you know of that's good for micronutrient profiling?
Yeah, I haven't looked into this in such a long time, just because I just don't think it's necessary in the vast majority of cases, unless there's like some sort of symptom showing up that's really kind of crazy. For most people, you can it's not going to inform anything you do in practice generally. If you look at what they're typically consuming and it's really poor, and you get them to start eating a better quality diet, and most of their diet from minimally processed foods and plenty of variety in terms of like vegetables and fruits they're consuming, and all other types of like minimally processed whole foods that we want to make up the bulk of their diet. Once they're doing that, like that's going to improve their nutrient status. If they're healthy and they're not having negative symptoms, it's unlikely they have a major deficiency. I would say for most people, and I mean they can obviously get testing with a doctor if they really need, and I would leave it to them to suss out if there's going to be an issue. I haven't looked into any of the kind of private labs that you can order tests from, just because I haven't found need to really, to be honest.
So just with the micronutrients, then it's just a case of variety of fruits and vegetables and that end of things, and the quality, and you should be hitting your numbers once you have your calories and macros in place. Yeah,
typically. So I mean, there's always some cases that make it more likely you could run into a suboptimal intake. So for example, if you're dieting, you're consuming less food overall, which means less micronutrition. If someone's strategy they find useful for dieting is to decrease food variety, which actually works pretty consistently, I found, at least anecdotally, with myself and a number of clients, of decreasing your variety of meals during a dieting phase makes it a bit easier, because again, you take away that different food stimulus. You just have very similar meals over and over again.
Probably a cognitive load as
Prep.
well, because obviously if
Right.
you're in a deficit, you don't think as clear, so you're saving some cognitive overload as well.
Right, and I think just a decreased food options and the time that you're spent thinking about and preparing foods and so on just can be useful from that perspective.
Yeah.
So that, and again, in that case, that might not be optimal from a health point of view of maximizing nutrient density. So with those kind of caveats in mind, if most of your diet is made up of good quality foods with that variety, then most people, I would say, are probably going to be pretty good, apart from some things that you could probably pay attention to that could be a bit better. One way to kind of get an idea of if your typical diet is actually providing you with enough micronutrients, there is a app that actually you can log in, similar to MyFitnessPal, except it looks at your requirement for micronutrients. It's called Chronometer. So you log it in, it gives you different a breakdown of the micronutrients in the diet. And if people want to take that step further, a friend of mine, Marty Kendall, who runs Optimizing Nutrition, he has this thing called a nutrient optimizer, which you can submit your Chronometer data to, and he runs it through this kind of essentially this algorithm that he's came up with to kind of give you a nutrient score. So it's like scored out of 100, I think. And it's based on the nutrient density, energy density, and I think like the insulin load of the diet. And so, I mean, that's one way for people to assess. Even if they just put it in through Chronometer, they will see typically on average if there's a couple of nutrients that they're always particularly low in. And then it might just be look up some sources, good quality sources of that food. Or if they want, they can go the supplementation route, I guess. And then obviously things like vitamin D. If someone's in a location where they're not getting a lot of sun exposure, pretty much us.
Damn you, Ireland. If Ireland just slide down towards Spain.
That'd be great. So if that's the case, get some like supplementation, particularly during the winter months. When it gets warmer outside, just try and get as much outdoor exposure as is practical for you. I would go with like Chronometer, and maybe Marty Kendall's Nutrient Optimizer might be a nice little add-on for people to play around with.
Perfect. So last two then, nutrient timing and frequency of meals, and then our supplementation. So timing, obviously, again, you'll take it away here, context dependent, general pop versus somebody with some athletic goals and demands.
Sure. So for athletes, this could be like an endless conversation because there's like so much, various different ways you could set up a training schedule, various different sports. There's loads of cool research now looking at, say, the periodization of carbohydrate intake and all the cool stuff that can do. So we'd probably best leave aside athletes for the moment. For the average person just looking at maintaining a healthy body composition, then your meal frequency doesn't seem to play really any role physiologically. So whether, again, that's like 3 larger meals versus 6 smaller meals, how that will influence your overall results, if it allows you to match the same overall intake of food over that day and it doesn't change anything to do with your expenditure, then it's going to have no real difference. Now, where it could have a practical difference is if it changes one of those variables, right? So again, practically for any one individual, going with a lower or a higher meal frequency might be a good move. But on the average, if you match it for all the other variables, it doesn't seem to have any major impact on, say, metabolic rate or how much calories you're going to burn or keeping your metabolism revved up or any of those typical things people hear.
What about, and I know if we're talking just, this, if we're talking in the general scheme of things, this probably, it isn't in the big rock category, maybe not. And I don't know when's the last time you might have looked into this, but is there anything to do with like optimizing meal frequency with like a circadian rhythm throughout the day?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting area, and again, I love looking at stuff here. It's this whole kind of emerging area of chrononutrition, which is kind of this subtopic of chronobiology. And I've talked to a few people about this on the podcast. So notably people like Dan Pardy and Jeff Rothschild, who are really good on this. And
Yeah, yeah.
so a guy, Greg Potter, who's a researcher in the UK, who's actually going to be working with Dan Pardy as well, who's done research in this area. And I mean, it's fascinating. There's definitely research that would support the view that your meal timing can influence circadian rhythms and therefore knock-on effects on health. And again, why I stop short of going into detail when I'm typically talking about this with people is for the average person just trying to get good intake down and something that fits in with their lifestyle as it is probably more important right now, and get that stuff correct. And I don't think the evidence is there just yet to say, okay, you must eat at these times. It's overwhelmingly strong now that you're doing yourself a health disservice by eating, say, late at night and not eating in a manner where you're eating in this way. So I don't think the evidence is there quite yet, at least in humans, but there's some really cool evidence showing that it can have quite a profound impact. And from at least one way you could interpret it, and certainly the way people like Jeff and Greg would talk about, is that as a kind of general easy rule for people to think about would be eating within daylight hours. So once it's kind of dark outside, that would signal a time where your feeding window is ended already, and that you're trying to keep your food intake within those daylight hours. So typically they'll also talk about maybe partitioning more of the calories earlier in the day can be beneficial. So having a, say, larger breakfast meal and having maybe a lower calorie meal as your final meal of the day potentially could support that as well. We do know that a stimulus for some of these peripheral clocks in the body. So like we have, to back up for some people, we have like this central circadian clock, and we also have like these peripheral clocks all around the body in various different organ tissues. And one of the kind of things that can be a stimulus for those is feeding. So we know by quite a large margin, the biggest thing that's going to influence your circadian rhythm via its impact on that master clock is light and dark cycles, like by far. Now, it's not so outside of that master clock, these peripheral clocks around the body, they can also be influenced by some things, one being nutrient intake. So the idea being, when you're up in the morning and you wake and you get that exposure to light is always a good thing. So get out into some sunlight if possible, but also then having a meal to signal to the body like there's some incoming nutrients and to kind of set that circadian rhythm potentially could be useful. So that's some of the hypotheses or the hypotheses that have been put forward. I think there's some decent stuff looking at it, but I would I'm not sure if it's strong enough yet to suggest people must do it. And I don't know like how far reaching the health implications directly for humans will be. And then the big thing is obviously, what are people's circadian rhythms like right now anyway, right? Like what other things are they probably not doing? Like if you're going to say I must eat these specific times, but then you also go to bed and are looking at an iPhone for an hour, like then you're kind of you've got your priorities mixed up, I guess. So in short, yes, there could well definitely be an influence of meal timing and nutrient intake on circadian rhythms, but practically how far I would go to recommend someone needs to follow a specific meal timing structure, I'm not too sure.
That's super interesting stuff, and I'll link to those podcasts. So Dan Pardy,
Jeff Rothschild, we
Rothschild,
looked at time restricted feeding, and then the one related to this was the one I did with Greg Potter. Yeah, so we looked at two actual research studies that have came out recently that looked at this idea.
Great. For the viewers and the listeners, we'll link those up to be sure. And if I forget, email me. That's great stuff, Danny. So lastly, on the hierarchy, and probably where a lot of the first questions come from people, but it's generally the least important, it is supplements. I had a really good conversation with Eric Helms on this on my own podcast. So is there anything, I mean, there's people who could be watching this and listening to this who are completely naive to this, but for myself and yourself, is there anything new that's come on the scene lately, and maybe touch into that secondary. But just first off, is what supplements do you recommend, if any?
Sure. So again, with the caveat that because of that hierarchy that you've laid out, that is kind of Eric kind of coined, supplements are kind of all those factors have a very small influence on overall results, a very tiny percentage. And so in the vast majority of cases, if there's other stuff you should be doing, like get that stuff nailed down first. Supplements may have some impact, but typically not a huge amount.
My favorite saying or analogy was, it's in Paul Chek's book, How to Eat, Move and Be Healthy, where he's like, eating a horrendous diet but taking the best supplements in the world is like trying to build a ship with rotten wood and golden nails. He's like, it still isn't going to flow.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, yeah, you're just going to undercut yourself if you're not doing the foundational stuff right. That said, there's supplementation. I suppose the clear benefit that it has is that it's easy. Of all the things, behavior change wise, it's fairly easy. Although, given the research we find on from medical literature of how infrequently people actually take medication they're prescribed, particularly when it's something so important, how often someone's actually going to stick to taking a supplement is probably not as nailed on as a behavior change thing.
Fail if you don't take this medication.
Right. Yeah. That means I'm kind of okay.
Yeah.
So yeah. With that said, there's probably a few supplements that we could talk about. I think again, this depends on what specific area someone wanted to get into and how far down like the optimization rabbit hole they're getting. But on a general surface level, just for most people, things to consider if they do want to supplement, like we mentioned, depending on your location and your exposure to sunlight, vitamin D is probably a great bet for a lot of people who don't have that exposure to sunlight, either because of their location or their say schedule or just circumstances.
Work or job,
I would say for people doing any sort of training that they care about performance, just take some creatine. I would say for a lot of, again, there's other ones that might be, that have decent impact, but we still need more work on. So for example, the research on probiotics is pretty strong that it can impart an immune benefit, both for athletes and general population. Now, where we're at with probiotics, though, is still trying to figure out like what exact strains do we want to use, and in what kind of doses, and in what different ones do we want to combine, and what does the optimal microbiome look like, and so on and so on. With that said, there are probably some probiotic supplements that are probably a good shout.
Is there any in particular you recommend? I know in the past was a prescriptive cyst you said?
Yeah, that's the one I've tended to stick with, just because again I haven't seen anything that has came out to suggest it's going to be worse than something else on the market.
Should they be in cold temperatures, Danny? Because you often walk in and see them on a shelf.
So that particular product is shelf stable, which is one of the reasons why I like recommending it. So that, and the fact that there's quite a number of different strains, because I'm a bit more wary of getting someone to like use real high dose supplementation with one specific strain, just because I don't know where we're at with the research right now. But I again, if someone's eating a high quality diet, how necessary they are is a different thing. So it might be just a nice little add-on. There's not too much else. I mean, you could think about obviously classic things like fish oil if someone doesn't eat fatty fish. But again, we have research is quite clear that consuming whole fish is actually more beneficial than using a fish oil supplement. And then you have some weird things of quite a bit of discrepancy in outcomes when you look at some of the data of just what supplementing with it does. I think from an insurance point of view, it's probably pretty good. Don't have to go crazy on the dose. Keep it fairly moderate. Normal dose if you're not going to consume fatty fish, but ideally do consume some. And then with a multivitamin, it seems to be a kind of similar story, that it doesn't seem to be actually that much of a beneficial impact when you look at most of the research. But for people who are concerned they're not getting enough in, it might be like a nice little insurance policy.
Yeah.
But again, the research on multivitamins doesn't tend to be that strong either.
Hmm.
Um,
There is one thing I know. Just going through my masters, and we were going through the physiology, and we going through like the, your energy systems, and like going through like things like your Krebs cycle and electron transport. But with the Krebs cycle anyway, and I remember going through some of Brian Walsh's courses, and like there was like so many reactions that were like catalyzed by like B vitamins, you know what I mean? And is what magnesium was that's another
mm,
huge one on the Krebs cycle. So it was just like you can see that if there is any deficits there in these like micronutrients that potentially supplement. And a good thing I suppose with the water soluble ones is that very hard to overdose on the water soluble ones, so
right. Yeah. So, I mean, um, yeah, most people, I don't think, I haven't seen too many people that have kind of major issues
yeah,
with B
yeah,
vitamins. So, magnesium can be actually one where there's some research showing that typical intakes in the population tend to be quite low.
just in case people we know it's a mineral, we know.
Right. Yeah. Mineral. So that tends to be quite low. So yeah, I would consider that might be something where you just focus more on making sure you have some high
Big time.
source of magnesium there as well.
Sweet, Danny, this was great. Just wrapping up on a few little fire round questions there. If you need to go to the toilet or anything now, let me know.
No,
You're
man,
ready.
no, I'm good for as long as you need,
If
man.
you
Yeah.
like start squirming and you're just wondering if they need to go to
Yeah.
the jacks or whatever.
No. No.
But just wrapping up here on some questions. What would you say have been the biggest things you've learned over the last 2 to 4 years, would you say? And I suppose maybe another way of wording that would be, what's the biggest thing you've changed your mind on the last 2 to 4 years?
Um, Man, I really just think it's this continued evolution of critical thinking,
Mm.
and it's something I've talked about for quite a while. But I just think when I first realized its importance, or that it's something to kind of aspire towards, I don't think my real understanding of what it actually is was as deep as it is now, and I don't think I actually practice as much as I do now. And
Do
I
you think that the pendulum has swung a little bit too much towards evidence based?
I think it's the problem now with this kind of evidence-based movement is people not understanding what the concept should stand for and misinterpreting what it is.
Yeah,
And this people tend to think that if you're being evidence-based, that means you need to support every recommendation that you make with a
research.
scientific reference, or anything you do with a client that isn't supported with a research paper is wrong. That's not what evidence-based practice is.
Mm.
And there's lots of things that we don't have research on now. So if you want to just not do anything, then fine. But there's just because we don't have research on a particular topic doesn't mean that it doesn't work, right? It's different if we have research that clearly demonstrates something is suboptimal or is a bad idea. Then sure, you shouldn't be doing that with people. And it's different if we have research clearly showing that this method is the best and will work, but you ignore that. They're both bad things to do. But if there's something where we just don't know yet, and you have lots of experience working with athletes or clients, and you've seen this thing work, then that's as good as any, right? Like that's great proof,
But
particularly when you
there is
consider the.
people who will still criticize that.
Oh yeah, but I mean, it's so easy to spot online. I can see them a mile away if you look at enough like Facebook forums when there's arguments break out. You can tell who the people are who are obviously really intelligent and like know a lot of exercise science or nutritional biochemistry, or probably just after graduating or maybe in college right now, and are really well read and have lots of references, but you can just tell that they've never coached anyone.
Mm.
You just tell the way they're discussing it. And then you have people who have coached loads of people, um, and understand the kind of underlying idea of evidence-based practice as well. It's just
Night and day
such
difference.
a difference. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
just so different, and because you don't get those people making like um, getting so overworked when someone puts forth an idea that doesn't have like a clear meta-analysis behind it, right? And particularly when we're working with one individual, as we talked earlier, I could put someone on a low carb diet, right? And the person who has like coaching experience is like, oh, that's kind of cool. Maybe this particular person responds best to those foods, or just likes the idea, and it's like this placebo effect. Or maybe this particular client over consumes on X, Y, and Z. So giving them an easy way of saying, just reduce your carbs is easy, right? A kind of coach will get that. Whereas that kind of person who's only into science says, well, do you not know that if you match calories and protein, then a low carb diet has no benefit? So why are you telling this person to eat that? They're missing out that what we recommend as an average recommendation is different to what you do with one individual person. So I've definitely seen that this kind of evidence-based thing, and a lot of it is people not understanding what evidence-based practice actually is. Two is people kind of jumping on this term and trying to use it. Maybe it's just like some sort of marketing shtick now. It's like, I'm evidence-based, and they're not really. And it's this fake use of science. Because you can make someone like look like they're basing what they do on science by just linking to enough research papers, but they could be cherry picking that research. They could be not reading it properly. They may be misinterpreting it. So their approach actually isn't scientific at all, but it looks like that person uses science. So using science like that versus actually thinking scientifically are two very different things.
What would your top resources and top life advice be to everyone watching and listening?
Resources first.
The resources now can be anything. They can be something to just live a better life. There could be a nutritional, a training, a spiritual, whatever it is.
Cool. So with resources, if people are interested in education and learning more, and particularly given your audience probably interested in strength training, body composition, so on, I think the Mass Research Review by Eric Helms, Greg Nuckols, and Mike Sordos,
which is currently right now on sale. But this episode will probably be posted well beyond that. But
you missed it.
Yeah, it's on like 30% off.
No. Honestly, for people, it's
phenomenal.
It's well worth getting it. It's really, really high quality. If you're interested in the mix of science and practical application, and want to stay up to date with science-based information, but don't want to have to go and read all the research yourself, then I recommend that. There's some other good research reviews out there I could mention. James Krieger's one at Weightology is really, really high quality. Again, there's a lot of training and nutrition stuff in there. Alan Aragon's one, if you're specifically more leaning towards nutrition and supplementation, they're all really good. Then, I mean, there's so many things depending on what people are looking for.
Would you recommend Martin McDonald's mentorship? I know he was a big influence on you.
Yeah, so Martin did a lot for me. If people are interested in getting an online nutrition course, Mac Nutrition Uni is Martin's course. Phenomenal course, by far one I'd recommend if people are interested in nutrition education. Don't
forget yourself, man.
Oh, I mean, I'll leave myself out of it. If people want to listen, they can. They're probably sick of listening to me after this, so they don't want to listen to me anymore.
Don't think so. Definitely with Sigma Nutrition, fantastic, unbelievable resource as well. So I'm always shocked when and it is a rarity nowadays, but I'm always like, when people say, what podcast is it? I'm like, yeah, well, listen to, when they're talking about like performance ones, you're like, Just Like Sports, Joel Smith and Pacey Performance and Mike Robertson's one. And then it's like, and then what for nutrition? Like Sigma Nutrition, of course, obviously that's the one I always listen to. And just like, it usually if it's an American, they mightn't have heard of it, but anyone in Ireland, they're like, oh yeah, everyone knows Danny Lennon's podcast. But no, they're great resources. Last two questions: the life advice. What would your top advice be to everyone? And it's funny because remember for a long time in your episode, everyone was like, gratitude. I was like, it was like definitely gratitude, but then when someone gave a different one, I was like, something different.
Yeah, man, I'm the last person that should be giving people life advice. People should not be listening to me.
I'd say Donald Trump's probably the last person who should give life.
I think he would give more wisdom than me. What do I know really? Like my life is a joke. I've thought about this because I've actually I did an interview for examine.com. Actually, I should have mentioned their research review.
Yeah, great resource.
The examine.com research digest, that's a research review. And so for, I think next month, so it'll be May 2018, that edition, they interviewed me in that for
Sweet.
that one, and kind of got asked a similar question. And so the way I've started to think about this is something that might be similar to that gratitude thing you mentioned, but I think is a very important distinction. Because for me, it's hard to just keep saying, oh, let's just be thankful for this, and keep saying like every day I'm thankful for whatever. I think a better way that I've tried to do it that has helped me, particularly when things are hard or seem a bit overwhelming, is the word perspective. And that was the answer I gave them, because there's so many ways we can find perspective, and it's very difficult at the time when something is going bad. But once you get out of that initial like real down point, there's just on an ongoing basis in your life, there's just such a great way to make yourself realize essentially how good we have it. Like anyone listening to this podcast is in a tiny, like the tiniest percentage of people in the world that have it the best, right? Of people living right now. And not only that, we're considering where we are in like human history, like the greatest of all time, right? So like most of the world, like 80% plus, I think was the last statistic I saw, is living on less than $10 a day or something crazy like that. Like we are profoundly like just lucky, and like I'm very aware that most of the stuff that I have is just purely down to luck. And I think putting that in that perspective is important. And I think it doesn't even have to go to that extreme, because I think we can oftentimes find it difficult to connect with that idea of realizing, well, what is it like living in a third world country? And most people are like, yeah, I know I have it much better than that, but it's still hard on a day-to-day basis, and especially when we see other people around us and social media and all that type of thing. I think you can even draw it back to a bit closer by just realizing that you might not be aware of it, but people around us often have gone through things that are far worse than what we're going through right now. And they're like the people just like the worst situations. Like go and just go and walk into like a children's hospital tomorrow and then like see what's going on, you know?
You know, it's so funny you mentioned that, because I live around the corner from the Mater Hospital, and it's one of my intentions just to walk in one day and go to like the cancer ward and just talk to people.
Yeah. And I mean, it's stuff that we can forget. And like, I'm not saying I'm this person who's like never feels down about stuff, because I keep perspective. I mean, every day I lose sight of this. And that's why I think it's an important practice for me to do, because I'll constantly complain about things or worry about things that just are so small compared to most things.
Preaching to the choir, Danny.
And I would finally say to people, if even looking to others like that is not something you want to do, one great way I like to keep perspective is just internally for yourself, that realize that in your lifetime, we're all going to face things that are like truly traumatic and truly like terrible that we're going to deal with in our life. And they will be legitimately times where you should be stressing and worried, and you can't avoid that, and feeling like despair. So don't feel those feelings at other times when you don't need to. Like there's plenty of time for that stuff. It's going to be coming. So realize that compared to that, probably the stuff that we're worrying about now is just like unimportant.
I don't know if it's like a Chinese proverb, but and I'm not too sure I heard it, but there's a saying that if you can control the situation, there's no need to worry about it. And if you can't control the situation, don't worry about it.
Right.
So it's just like accept.
It's kind of it's mirrored in like Stoic philosophy as well. You get kind of
Yes.
similar things like that, you know.
Yeah.
And again, like you said, it's easier said than done. And I think at the time something bad happens, it's difficult to do. But on most normal days, it's very easy to do, because you just remember, okay, think about any of the real bad things that have either happened to you or someone you know, and like it kind of brings back perspective, I guess. So,
you know, one individual who had a massive influence on me in terms of having more perspective on things that most people would perceive as bad or traumatic things was Alan Watts. And like what he made me realize was that like the universe works through a dualistic mechanism, So he's basically saying like you would not know happiness if you did not know sadness. You would not know good if there was no bad. You wouldn't know left without right. So he's like, when you are in deep despair, like he's like, this gives bliss, like happiness, more of a blissfulness to it, because you wouldn't have anything to compare it against. So he's like, it's all part of the journey of life. It's all part of the growth process. So he's like, when you kind of step back and look at it from that, it's kind of like, it's all just a journey then. Like it's like,
Yeah.
and then like I always have that Lincoln saying in my head, Dan Faft always says that he's like, this too shall pass. So it's funny because for the viewers watching this and the people listening, like I'm having a nightmare with my laptop right now. But there's a voice in my head, like it keeps like cutting off. So like during this interview with Danny, he's like, I hope this isn't shit to bed. But like in the back of my mind too, I'm like, I have Tony Robbins, and he often says like, this is a first world privilege problem. I'm worried about a laptop. Like, what a privileged problem to have. Like, he'd call that he has this famous scene where he goes, hands up who loves surprises. And everyone's like, woo, yeah, I love surprises. And he goes, you're all liars. Because he's like, when it's something you don't want, you call it a problem.
Right. Yeah.
But like just in my head, I'm just like, I'm not complaining, but I'm worried that like my laptop might fail in today's interview. And I'm just like, and then I won't have an interview, and then I'll be stressed, and then I'll be trying to fix the laptop. I'm just like, you have a laptop. Like, what are you complaining about?
Yeah, I think I like the point you make about like those contrasting forces, essentially what show things up. And one person that I'm kind of reading a lot at the moment is Jordan Peterson, and he has this great quote where
everywhere right now.
He's blown up, and again, whether everyone listening likes
because the Sam Harris interviews.
But I really like his way of thinking. And again, some people probably won't, but hey,
yeah, fair enough.
He has this great quote where he says, I'm kind of paraphrasing, but it's essentially, it's only when you realize your capacity to do evil that you can kind of see your ability to do good. And I think that kind of realization that, like, as humans, we all have this potential to do evil, like we all do. And so you only realize then how good you can be and how much good you can do in the world when you realize that kind of contrast.
Yeah, great stuff. So Danny, last question, and let you go then. So I'm going down to Limerick, and I ask you for dinner, and I say to you, listen, Danny, I know you already think I'm a weirdo, but you're going to think I'm even more weird. And you're like, what are you talking about? It's like, I have magic powers. And you're like, okay. It's like, I can bring people back from the dead. So I'm going to say to you, listen, we're going for dinner, and you can bring 5 people to this dinner, and they can be either dead or alive. Who are you going to bring to this dinner, and why?
Oh, man.
And just so you know, too, people always get like stomped because they're afraid to leave someone out. You can change your mind.
Right. I'll give a few obvious ones at the top of the head that I would like to have dinner with. And again, a lot of people won't agree with some of them, but they're just personal ones.
Yeah.
The first would be Arsene Wenger, current manager of Arsenal, that is due to retire now. So as a lifelong Arsenal fan, and the fact for 22 years of my life he's been in charge, I just find him fascinating, and the kind of what he's able to achieve in elite level sport, and the kind of essentially a whole shift in a paradigm when he was brought in, and then obviously the kind of personal attachment to the club for me.
Cool.
I would like to have Tim Ferriss there. So again, this is one of the figures where a lot of people, he's very kind of polarizing. A lot of people, I'm sure, listening probably despise him, and I've certainly been aware of. I disagree with a lot of his like nutrition and fitness advice, but just in general, some of his work and his first book, for example, had a large impact on what I ended up doing. And I just like the way he thinks about things and talks. I would say Tim Ferriss.
Just on Ferriss, anyone who puts themselves out there to that extent, I've got nothing but admiration for him, you know?
Right. Yeah, agreed. I mean, people are going to not like people for whatever reason. Let me see. Seeing as we mentioned Jordan Peterson, let's put him in there.
Yeah.
Can't do any harm to bring that to it. Oh, man.
It's an interesting group so far. I wonder if Wenger and Ferriss, what would they talk about? I could see Peterson and Ferriss talking an awful lot.
Yeah, I'm trying to get a few varied ones. Although I do believe Wenger has a degree in philosophy, so
Yeah, yeah.
he can chime in there with Jordan Peterson for a bit. Let's put in Tracy Chapman,
Oh,
the singer. Yeah.
wow, that's a big. Where did that come from?
I don't know. I just think it would be given the kind of era she came up in and
Nice, yeah.
success she had, and just as some of the stuff she probably had to overcome as well. I think to be interesting insights. So there's 4, and then me. Is that 5, or do you need
No,
someone
you've
else?
one more. You can bring 5.
Do you want me to bring you? Is that what you're trying to hint at?
No, 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 no. I'm already going. No, we can bring 5.
Oh, you're
I'm
going.
going. I'm
Oh,
going.
okay. You're going. Oh man.
I've got to bring people back from the dead here. So no one yet though.
Yeah. Do you want? I'll put in another author of a book that I've read quite a few of, Ryan Holiday.
Nice.
So I don't know if there's gonna be too much overlap with him and Ferris, but I like Ryan Holiday's work, and I think he's interesting, and I think someone like that, maybe a Ryan Holiday, or maybe like a Robert Greene or someone like that.
Yeah, Robert Greene.
Could
Yeah, I
be
love his
interesting.
work. I love Robert Greene and Ryan
So,
Holiday. But he,
so I think I got everyone that's still alive, right?
yeah.
So technically, this can still happen if we reach
So
out to
if
enough
any
people.
of you 5 see this,
If any of you want a free dinner in Limerick, contact me.
free. They're millionaires. They can pay.
It's on you, man.
Oh Jesus.
Sponsored by OPEX.
Sponsored by, yeah, James Fitzgerald will be paid. We'll have
Yeah.
to bring James and make it 6 people.
Mm.
Danny, that's absolutely brilliant. So that's a hell of a long podcast. I think we're might be 2 hours, far off 2 hours, so it might be a part 1 and part 2. But
Yeah.
more
Feel free
content.
to chop out some of my pauses at the end, and that'll probably take up 20 minutes for you.
No problem. Listen, Danny, great stuff. Obviously, stay online while I wrap up here. So for everyone watching this on the YouTube channel and everybody listening to this on whatever podcast app they do, hope you really enjoyed that episode with Danny Lennon. Be sure to check out Sigma Nutrition. Definitely my top resource when it comes to everything to do with nutrition. And there's also a lot of training talk on there too. But Danny is the man when it comes to things to do with nutrition and science and just health and wellness. That podcast is absolutely fantastic. So I'll be linking all up into the show notes. But for everyone viewing, take care. I'll talk to everyone soon. From Robbie Bourke from OPEX. Peace. And also,
See you there, guys. Thanks for listening.
all right. Thanks, Danny. Thanks, guys. See you later.